I'm Mary Lyons, and I am the Wealth Woman.
And I'm Eric Alexander from Benchmark Income Group.
And this is the Big Wealth Podcast.
Everything you've ever been taught about money is wrong.
But don't worry, we're here to help.
On this podcast, we'll use the same tools you already know to actually help set you free.
Free to do what you want with your time, with your money, and with your energy. Free to live your life the way you have dreamt about.
So we're going to talk about wealth knowledge, personal reflections, and the financial industry news of the day.
Welcome to the Big Wealth Podcast.
And we are so excited to have Ryan Holliman back on the program today, our first recurring guest. And the program we wanted to talk to him about today is why really seemingly smart people make really dumb decisions about their money and what's going on behind it, and how to seemingly smart people do things that don't seem so smart about their money. So it's glad to have you. We're excited to have you back. Thanks, Ryan.
Yes, thanks. Glad to be here. One of the things when we talk about making bad decisions, which that's sort of how I make my money,
job security, Ryan.
Yeah.
Job security.
One of the driving forces in counseling right now is an approach called cognitive behavioral therapy. And the basic idea behind it is, I always ask clients two questions when we talk about their thinking. Is that factually true according to evidence? And two, is that a helpful way to think? So one of the things that I deal with so much is something we call all or nothing thinking. Basically, the idea you're either all in or you're all out, and there's no in between. And that gets us into lots of difficult situations. It's okay. Some of you may
feel like you're describing me a little bit right now, that all in or all out. I've been told I have an on switch and an off switch and nothing in between. So you have my attention.
Yeah. So, okay, let's imagine you're trying to be healthier coming out of the pandemic, right? But then somehow you eat one bite of ice cream. All or nothing thinking would say, well, you've already screwed up your diet. You might as well eat the whole pint.
Right.
And in fact, you know what? Why not order a few pizzas to wash it down with? Because we're already there.
I'm loving everything right now.
Yeah. And so
it's like you're in my head.
And so what I tell people, whether it's their physical health, their mental health, or their financial health, is what's the next healthy decision you can make? Because all or nothing thinking says, well, I've already screwed up, so I might as well just lean into that, as opposed to trying to mitigate problems.
Well, I can definitely see that where somebody's looking at their budget and, they overspend on, something, let's say something frivolous. And then they're like, well, I already screwed it up. So I might as well, buy the whole outfit and the shoes instead of just the shirt.
I'm already in debt $500. What's another $1,000?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Or someone that says, I didn't start saving for retirement at 25 or 35. So no reason to do it now. Let's just let the good times roll, or just plan to work till I'm dead.
We definitely hear that. I'm never going to retire. I'm going to work till I'm dead.
And that's
what if you can't?
Right. Yeah. What if your body gives out before you can? Right. But that's interesting. We had this conversation earlier today, just like an hour or two ago, with a lot of clients. And we say, hey, look, here's what you're doing, and you can do this, and this will make all your problems better. And they're like, that seems like a big leap. I just think I'm going to do nothing. And we sort of joke. It's like, well, you could do half of it, right? If you could do small change, you could start making your way towards that. And it seems like that thought never enters their thought process of like, well, I feel uncomfortable about the big plan. So I'm going to do either no big plan or the big plan or no plan. And they don't think about, what if I did a half a plan, right?
The analogy that I use all the time when I'm talking to people that I can see are stuck in that space is like, some of my clients are totally comfortable cannonballing into the deep end, right? Like, sweet, this is amazing. Let's go, big splash. We're doing all of it. And then other of my clients, they need to like toe in the kiddie pool, let the temperature adjust for a little bit, right? Then move on to the second step. And then eventually they get to like full submersion in the pool and they're swimming, but it's a different process depending on who you're talking to, right? I mean, some people need to do it in baby steps and some people are okay, jumping all in at once. And I don't know that one way is better than the other, except that I will say that a lot of times people who toe into it end up being more consistent over time.
No, I think you're talking about that sustainability of change, which is why I'd always rather someone take one step instead of take a flying leap, but then not have it in them to do it again.
Right.
Right. Because the effort is so monumental. Right.
Yeah. Well, and I think for me, there's a big difference between, okay, how much it takes to keep something going versus that investment to start something.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll tell clients, one of the things, I work with a lot of people who are depressed and their environment just becomes more chaotic because they're like, well, those dishes are there, but I don't feel like it. So I'm not going to do it. And so I say, if I'm asking you to do something you hate doing, do it for 5 minutes. If you still hate it after 5 minutes, you can stop. But if you just try it once, you might find you hate starting it, not doing it. So
Eric raised his hand. If you're just listening to this, you can't see it, but Eric's going, I don't want to do the dishes right now.
Well, that's it, right? But it's so funny because once I start doing the dishes, I'm like, oh, look, I've cleared off a spot on the counter. I can see the spot, and the rest of the dishes don't seem so overwhelming.
You get inspired by the progress almost.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think this is interesting. So one of the things that we see specifically when it comes to money is people with spending problems, right? Where, they buy one thing or two things and then they kind of keep it going. And I find that frequently people dig themselves into a pretty big hole. And then because they're in the hole, they can't figure out how to get out of it, right? Like especially people whose spending is tied to how they're feeling emotionally. And I kind of jokingly in another episode said, I'm an emotional spender, right? When I feel bad, I spend to make myself feel better. And when I feel good, I spend to celebrate. And so it doesn't really matter what emotion I'm having, it's triggering a spend, right? And I have figured out how to put like guardrails around myself so that I'm never in a position where I am overspending. But I think that's sort of what you're talking about, that all or nothing, is that when people go in, they're like, okay, well, I'm going to spend all of it. And one of the things that I noticed about myself when I was in my 20s is that when I had money, I really didn't find anything I wanted to buy. Like it was like nothing was really quite good enough. And then when I didn't have money, I wanted everything. So can you talk maybe a little bit about what causes that? Point. Because it's a totally different psychological response to the identical merchandise.
Right. So I think there are a few things going on. One is this idea of magical thinking, which essentially says you associate two things that aren't causational, but act as if they are.
Okay.
Right? So, for instance, I will share a story. My grandmother grew up in the post-war era. Her dad was a blacksmith, and so money was not always very plentiful.
Abundant.
And so what she did was she would ask for a milkshake. And if her dad said yes, they were financially good. If he said no, then I need to worry.
It's a canary in the mine.
But now, like, her, dad is long gone, doesn't have money problems, but you still tie in that makes me feel safe. Therefore, this object doesn't just represent a delicious milk-based treat, it represents safety. The fact is, a milkshake isn't safety. It's not. Right?
It's fascinating.
And so I think we associate those things. Like when you jump on Amazon, you're like, oh, Prime Day's coming up. What's good there? And you get something because in your mind, at some point, you bought something and it made you feel better when you weren't feeling great. And so you said, I'm going to recreate that.
Right.
And that's a problem for a couple of reasons. One is you're talking about correlation, not causation. So you have to really look at, does this make me feel better? I think the other thing that we have to look at is, are you using one tool to solve all of your problems? Like, if you want to buy something that makes you feel better, great, but I don't ever want you to have one solution that's the only thing you can turn to for all of your problems.
Mhm.
And what this really gets down to, and I see this a lot in companies, is a tie to the process as opposed to the outcome. Like, when I care about, like, I have a few clinicians in my employ, I don't tell them how to do their jobs. All I say is, I want you to help people get better. If you achieve that outcome, I don't care how you do it, as long as you don't break a law. But so many times we get consumed with like,
Guardrails is good.
yeah, just like, don't get arrested.
Little things. Yeah.
But we get consumed with, well, I like doing it this way. Well, that's great, but it might not give you the outcome you want. So let's look at lots of different options.
Well, that goes back to what you said about, is it true and is it helpful? At some point, the process you're using may no longer be helpful. And I actually think, and I'm gonna kind of jump on this for a second. There's a couple of talking heads in our industry who are really good at specific things. So debt pay down, for example, or not overspending. And at some point, you kind of graduate from that into the bigger, broader picture of, now that I have good, healthy money habits, how do I actually grow the assets? And
right.
So there's a very different mentality when you're looking at not overspending and living within your means. Basically, if you think about spending almost like alcoholism, where it's an addiction and you're overdoing it, and once you start, you can't stop. Like, you need to get help to get off of that. But once you get to the point where you are consistent about saving money, then you have to get very strategic about where you're putting it, right? And so I think what you're saying is so key, because sometimes the process that gets you from point A to point B is no longer effective when you're trying to get from point B to point C. And that's where I think personal growth is so key, because you have to be able to objectively look at it and say, yeah, that got me here, but is it going to get me there?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm really glad you brought up the alcohol analogy, because one of the things I say when someone comes to me with a problem with alcohol or cigarettes is, I never want to take that out of your hands until I put something in your hand to replace it.
Yep. You can't stop drinking. You got to start running.
Yeah. Something, but you've got to have some sort of pressure release. And so I think this is one thing we work on with people who struggle with eating problems is most people who struggle with overeating, like, I'm just going to throw out random numbers, but like maybe 70% of their eating is eating for entertainment. And 15% is, or like, I want to feel good, and a hamburger does that. So that's going to help. And then maybe a small portion is like, oh, I've just got to survive the day, so I need to put fuel in my system. When really it should be the opposite. Like, oh, I've got a little bit of a budget for fun eating, but mostly it's just to make sure I don't die. Like, I need to make sure that, I think the same could be applied to money. Like, how much of your spending is things you need, things you have to buy, versus what's your entertainment. And I think we can get those flipped a lot. And certainly I've seen people who I'm like, oh yeah, your proportions are way off. And that doesn't work until you figure out, oh, there are lots of things to do to feel fulfilled and happy that don't require a credit card purchase.
So yeah, that's been, sorry, Mary, that's been interesting on my part of it, because I noticed that when my mental health is at its peak, I don't need a lot of crap. Like, but when I'm, depressed or bored or whatever, right? When I'm not at the top of my, when I'm not at the top of my game, I'm like, oh, I wonder what's on Amazon today, right?
Yeah, because you're looking for like that dopamine hit of like, hey, this is like, I have found that, so I'm not always the best sleeper. It's gotten much better in current years, but sometimes I find myself up at 3 a.m. and one of the things that I really had to just like discipline myself about is that I'd be like, oh, I wonder what's on sale. And at 3 a.m, your cognitive powers are not at their best. And so
everything's on sale.
Well, sometimes I would buy stuff and then not even remember that I bought it until it showed up. And then I'm like, oh, hey, yeah, okay, I kind of remember doing that. And so, I think I don't know, I think there have to be certain rules that you look at. And even like kind of deeper to that point, I remember having a conversation with a young man who had overspent. And then I guess PayPal had offered him a credit card. So he overspent more. And he was probably making 50 grand a year, but he easily had $30,000 to $40,000 worth of credit card debt. So that looking at his budget, there was no way that he could make ends meet without charging something on the card, even paying minimum payments on the credit card. And, we had some conversations like this is the point in my practice when I run into something like that, where, money is not math, it's human behavior. And at some point I'm like, okay, maybe I'm a little out of my depth here, because the thinking that got you into this predicament in the first place has to be fixed before we can get you out of it. Because even with some of the options that he had available to him to kind of refinance that debt and get it within a budget, to him, he saw that and was like, oh, I've got wiggle room. And I could see even from talking to him about it, that this is like, none of the work I'm doing is going to fix this, because it's not a math problem. Like, what the numbers are. There's something else going on, like a hole that you're trying to fill or that you're trying to somehow validate. And for him in particular, because I'm nosy, so I ask a lot of questions, it was that he was running with a crowd that had substantially more income than he did. And so he wanted the shoes, the clothes, all the cars, the things that they had. And because he had destroyed his credit, they were that much more expensive as well. And so that feeling of belonging, I think, is such a deep need for us as human beings. And so in a situation where like the purchases are motivated by that need to belong, because we run into clients, like I would say on a fairly regular basis, where maybe we work with the friends and the friends have, twice the income. And then there's the one friend who's getting themselves into financial trouble trying to keep up with the rest of the group. So in a situation like that, where you have really smart people, but their spend is tied to, well, everybody's going on this trip to Cabo together, or, everybody's going out to eat dinner. And I don't want to be the one who's like, hey, we need separate checks. I just ordered a salad and water, right? They just throw in the card because that's what everyone else is doing. And they're like, I'll figure out, the budget later, when I'm like, oh man, we spent $300 at dinner and maybe that wasn't in their budget, right? So what do you recommend in a situation like that, where it's sort of, I think the old school way of saying that is keeping up with the Joneses.
Right. And so where I would really go is from a data-driven perspective. So this experience that you want to go do, this vacation, this whatever, one is, does it give me what I want? I think the other thing, and I know this has become very popular in lots of circles, but I always ask people to think about their personal brand, or if you want a little less cheesy, their reputation, and think about, what's my mission in life, and does this fit in with it? I'll give it, for instance, I had a colleague who was talking about keeping up with the Joneses from a business perspective. Mm-hmm. She said, well, there's this other person that has this practice and they're growing like this and they're doing this and that. And I said, when I hear that none of that is interesting to me. That all sort of makes me sick to my stomach.
Right. Well, that's the other part of, the sick to my stomach part of it, I think is sort of key, because it's like, I remember, Mary, you had a friend that had that conversation with you of, whose scorecard are you playing on?
Right.
Like, is that your scorecard? Like, or is that somebody else's scorecard?
Right. Well, and until she asked me that question, I had never thought about it. It was just, these are the things you do, right? These are the things that are
Right.
expected. This is how you know you're successful, right? Like, these are the things that you own. These are the things that you do, right? Because I think the media plays a big role in kind of shaping our view. And depending on what you're consuming, I think that also, creates different outputs. And I look even on like Instagram and Facebook and some of the groups and the hashtags that are out there that are around money. And a lot of it is very consumer driven as opposed to mission driven. And so this idea of what is your mission in life, I really like that, Ryan, because I think so many people have not asked themselves that. They're just kind of living this life of default where like these things happen, I respond to this stimulus, and it's all reactionary as opposed to like deliberate. And what do I want and how am I building it? And I do think that it becomes a lot easier to make good financial decisions when you know what you're working towards. And I have a client that came to me that kind of fits some of the demographic of this. And, the thing that they wanted most in life was a second home. And so it was like, well, are the decisions you're making right now moving you towards that second home? Because you can get a second home and then do short-term rentals to pay for it and maybe even make a profit, but you have to have capital in order to do that. So if you keep spending all your capital, you can't do that. And it was like, I don't know, it was like a light bulb went off and they were like, okay, now we have something specific that we're working towards. But until they could articulate what they were working towards, they just kind of did what they did because there wasn't an end goal,
Yeah.
and I think that's pretty common. Like,
well, that was Ryan's point. I think that he you made earlier was that you don't stop smoking, you start whatever.
Yeah.
Like you have to have something to fill. You're doing X. If you're going to go the other place, you need something bigger to go shoot for, right? Otherwise, you're just going to keep defaulting.
Right. So I have an acquaintance who lost their husband early, like at age 50.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because they were substantially overweight and very unhealthy. And she was heavier too. And she said, I got to be there for my kid, right? I have to change what I'm doing right now to make sure that I'm in my kid's life and that I get to meet the grandbabies, because she saw how awful it was for her child to deal with the loss of a father. Right. And so there was all of a sudden a mission and a reason to do those things. And without that tie-in, I think it's hard to keep going. I mean, Eric, you and I talk about this with that sense of purpose. Like, our job's not always easy. Sometimes it's incredibly difficult, right? Especially because you're dealing with people and their emotions and, it's complex math and that sort of thing. But when you're tied into a purpose, it's easier to keep going. And when you're reliant on passion, that comes and goes, that ebbs and flows. And so if you're making the decisions based on how you feel at any given moment, I think it's harder to make good decisions than it is when you give yourself a measuring stick and a purpose and a vision for what you're trying to do, because then you have a filter. Do I do this? Does it get me closer or does it take me further away from this? And I think most people don't have that, honestly.
Right. Yeah, well, and what was the famous George Bernard Shaw quote, right? The newbie writers or the amateur writers write when they feel like it, and the professional writers write because it's today. Like, that we're going to get up and we're going to write every single day because that's what we do. We write, right? Because we're writers. But and Ryan, one of the things that I kind of thought through on that side of it, this sort of idea of what was it, Nietzsche or Frankl or whoever, a man with a strong enough why can bear any how, right? I mean, I think that purpose sort of drives it. So there's a countervailing sort of concept though that I keep sort of fighting with internally that says I should be a learner, right? All leaders are readers. I can never learn less. I should always be growing and expanding what I know and what my view of the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering how you balance that out between I'm working and I want to see what Mary's doing. I want to see what Bob is doing and Steve are doing and Susie's doing. Like, how are they managing their lives? What things that are they doing that I could learn from and do and grow into that I don't already know? And so the thing I keep sort of wrestling with a little bit is how do you have I want to grow and get better without feeling like you're chasing the Joneses?
Right, that's a good question. And one of the first things, if you were a client in my office, I would I would latch on to is that you used the S word. Should, right? So there was a famous
Yes.
psychiatrist in the 70s that said, be careful that you don't should all over yourself. And so for me, the first thing I really want to explore is it I should do this or I want to do this, right? So looking at, is this an external expectation or is this something within me? I think the other thing is it's fine to look at other people and what they're doing, but you need to make the evaluation. Is this person headed in a direction that I want to be going? Is their mission similar to me? Or is their unique value proposition, the direction their life going, completely different? Right.
Well, I think you almost have to add into that too skill sets. Like, is their skill set and my skill set the same? Because certainly, like, I think about, oh, I should be more organized. That is never, it's never going to happen, right? If you look at every personality assessment I've ever taken, I'm great from a visionary perspective. I'm creative. I'm good with ideas. I like getting people on board with what I'm doing. But if you look at my ability to be like perfectly organized, I am at my best when I am so overloaded that I cannot possibly get to everything, because I find that to be exciting, versus if I complete one task and then I put it away and then I get the next task out and I do that to completion and then I put it away. Like, if I had to do that all day, especially if it's repetitive tasks, I would implode. It would just never work. And I remember, I think it was, I can't remember whether it was the Colby A assessment or exactly what it was, but when I realized, like, you can spend a lot of effort on this and it's never going to get materially better, maybe slightly, but not materially.
Strengths Finder.
Yeah, or Strengths Finder, or you can focus on building your strengths and find someone who's really good at this one thing and you get them to do it. Because I love being organized, but my assistant does all that. I mean, she comes in at the end of the day, she takes everything, she makes my to-do list for the next day, and then she'll come in and check on me and be like, these things have to happen by the end of the day. So I'm going to sit here until you knock this out, knock this out, knock this out. And then she's like, okay, I'm gone. You go do the things that you feel you need to do to kind of grow the scope of
adult babysitter.
Right. But I think that idea of I should be this other person, all that does is make things worse. And when I think about like the times in my life, like in college, I suffered from pretty severe depression, missed midterms, stuff like that. It was because this sort of vision of who I was supposed to be versus who I actually was, they didn't line up. Right? Like, I was living in other people's expectations as opposed to figuring out my priorities and what was important to me. And I think when people get stuck in that spot, that's when they do things like overeat or overindulge, whether it's drinking or whether it's money spending or any of that, is that there is a hole because they feel somehow unworthy, right? And they are trying to fill that hole with something else. And you know, I can't necessarily speak to how you figure out that you're worthy, but I think so much of it is just letting go of other people's expectations of you. I mean, so I see a therapist pretty regularly. I think everyone should. I think it makes people better human beings, right? If you have an outside person pointing out your blind spots to you, like, everyone benefits from that. But what he said is, your opinion of me is none of my business. And that like hit home for me in such a deep way that, like, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks of me. What matters is how I think of myself. That dramatically changed so much about my life. And that fed into that scorecard conversation that Eric mentioned earlier, is that, like, when you figure out what's important to you, it's a lot easier to make decisions that are consistent with that. But if you don't spend any time thinking about what's important to you, there's no way you can be deliberate about accomplishing it.
Yeah. And I think, sort of speaking to some of the stuff you were talking about, it's important to understand what are my immutable characteristics. They're probably just there to stay. And what are things that are changeable? Mm-hmm. So sort of speaking, Eric, you were talking about growing and learning. I work as a professor. most of my professor friends would blanch at this, but I stopped reading my student teaching evaluations. Not because I don't want to grow, but because it didn't give me useful data. And the stuff they would comment on was stuff that's not going to change. I've been teaching for over a decade. I'm not going to be I teach a lot of child counseling classes. I'm not going to be the guy that, like wears a wooden necklace or like does all the cutesy stuff. Like, that's not going to be me. I'm the guy who's going to use complicated $64 words and assumes you're as smart as I am. So just keep up. So, but there are some things that I can change, but I didn't get that from the teaching evaluations.
Right. You should learn to play the bongos because that'll help with child rearing. Yep, I'm not doing that. We're out.
Nope. No, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not actually, but yeah, I think all this is so key, right? And I'm going to go back to just a couple of things that you said, just in summary, to kind of bookend the conversation. I love the idea of sort of the evidence-based approach, right? Yep. Where is this true and is this helpful? Those two questions, I think, are incredible, because something can be true and not helpful, or it can be helpful maybe, but not true. And it's when you find both together that there's magic in that. And then I like what you said, you're not all in or all out. It's really about taking like small steps in the right direction. Because realistically, that's what success is. It's small habits on a daily basis, little steps that make the huge difference in the long term. And then I like that you said, kind of figure out the mission in life, the purpose of what you're doing, because then you have a way to measure it, right? Is this getting me closer to the things I actually want, or is it taking me further away? And then I'm going to add, the more you can automate, the less there is for you to mess up. Right. And so if you're listening right now and you haven't listened to the episode where we talk about automating your budget, go listen to that one, because that will be a springboard to help with the rest of the decisions if you can get that piece going in a healthy way. So Ryan, is there anything that we should have asked that we didn't, or that you want to add in closing?
So there's one thing I will add when we talk about this idea of, is this factually true? It's always important to sort out opinions from facts. Facts are things which are grounded in reality, where, especially when it comes to money, right? You have so many people touting their opinions as facts. And so I think that's always important to feel like, is this something that a physicist would agree is objective reality? That's a fact. Everything else is just opinions or feelings.
Evidence-based financial planning. You heard it here. That's what you need. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.